April 11, 1951. 1 o'clock in the morning, Washington, D.C. The decision had already been made before the city was awake, before newspapers could react, before Congress could organize its outrage. President Harry S. Truman sat with a short prepared statement in front of him and ordered it released to the press without ceremony. There would be no advance warning. There would be no consultation with Congress. There would be no attempt to soften the language. Douglas MacArthur was relieved of all his commands. The order was precise. MacArthur was removed as Commander-in-Chief of United Nations forces in Korea, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, and as head of United States Army forces in the Far East. In a single stroke, the most famous American general alive was stripped of every position that gave him authority. Only a handful of men knew this was coming. Secretary of Defense George Marshall had been informed. General Omar Bradley had been consulted. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had given their unanimous assent. No one involved believed the decision would be politically survivable, but all agreed it was operationally unavoidable. MacArthur himself was not consulted. He learned of his dismissal through a routine military cable in Tokyo hours after the announcement was released in Washington. There was no opportunity to respond, no chance to negotiate, no warning shot. The language of the statement was deliberately restrained. Truman did not accuse MacArthur of incompetence. He did not reference strategy, battlefield performance, or personal character. The justification was narrower and more severe. MacArthur had failed to respect the authority of the president and the constitutional principle that military commanders do not set national policy. This was not a debate about Korea. It was not an argument about China. It was a command decision about control. At that moment, Truman understood exactly what would follow. The backlash, the collapse of his approval ratings, the accusations of weakness and betrayal. He issued the order anyway. The chain of command was reasserted. Then the statement ended. At the moment Truman acted, the military situation still offered a genuine range of options. The war in Korea had not yet hardened into stalemate. The Chinese intervention, though severe, had not closed every path. What existed in early 1951 was not a desperate battlefield, but a strategic crossroads, and that distinction mattered. United Nations forces had stabilized the front after the winter retreat. The catastrophic collapse MacArthur had warned about had not occurred. Chinese offensives had inflicted heavy losses, but they had also exposed the limits of Chinese logistics, mobility, and air defense. Intelligence assessments showed that Chinese forces were operating at the edge of their supply capacity, dependent on long, vulnerable lines stretching back across the Yalu. They lacked air cover, mechanization, and sustained artillery support on a scale comparable to American forces. Militarily, containment was working. The front could be held. South Korea could be preserved without expanding the war. This was the central calculation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Truman administration. Korea did not need to be won in the absolute sense MacArthur demanded. It needed to be prevented from becoming a trigger for a wider conflict. There were alternatives available that did not involve escalation into China. A fortified defensive line, supported by overwhelming American air power, could bleed Chinese forces over time. Naval dominance allowed the United States to choose where pressure was applied and where it was withheld. Strategic bombing of North Korean infrastructure remained an option. Negotiations, though unattractive, were not impossible once the front stabilized. MacArthur rejected all of this. He insisted that limited war was a contradiction. In his view, fighting China without attacking China was militarily irrational and morally dishonest. He argued that expanding the conflict would shorten it, that decisive force would prevent prolonged bloodshed. From a purely operational perspective, this argument had internal logic, but it also carried unacceptable risk. Attacking Chinese territory would almost certainly draw the Soviet Union directly into the war. American intelligence did not speculate on this point. It treated it as probable. Soviet pilots were already covertly flying MiGs over Korea. Soviet advisors were embedded with Chinese units. Escalation would collapse the careful ambiguity that was keeping the conflict limited. A general war with China, and possibly the Soviet Union, was not a military problem alone. It was a political catastrophe in waiting. The United States did not possess sufficient ground forces to fight a full-scale land war in Asia while maintaining commitments in Europe. NATO was fragile. Western Europe depended on American protection. A widened Asian war would force impossible choices. This was the opportunity Truman saw. Not an opportunity to destroy China, but an opportunity to enforce limits. To prove that civilian leadership could define the scope of war, even when the battlefield tempted commanders to push further. MacArthur viewed these limits as weakness. Truman viewed them as strategy. The opportunity was real because restraint was still viable. The front had not collapsed. The alliance had not fractured. Nuclear weapons existed, but their use remained theoretical. Escalation was not yet inevitable. That window would not stay open forever. Truman understood that if a senior commander could publicly undermine policy during a limited war, then no future conflict could be contained. Korea was not just a battlefield. It was a test case. The decision that followed was shaped by that understanding. By the time the Korean War entered its second winter, Truman no longer relied on impressions or personalities. He relied on records. What distinguished this moment from every earlier confrontation with MacArthur was not emotion, but documentation. Truman had been tracking MacArthur's behavior since 1945, not casually, systematically. As Supreme Commander in Japan, MacArthur operated with extraordinary autonomy. He rewrote a constitution, dissolved institutions, and governed a defeated nation with minimal interference from Washington. Truman accepted this arrangement because it served a purpose. Japan was stable. The occupation was successful. MacArthur delivered results, and as long as he did, his methods were tolerated. But Truman never accepted the idea that tolerance was consent. Each time MacArthur exceeded his authority, Truman noted it. Each time MacArthur communicated with Congress, the press, or foreign leaders without clearance, it was logged. The president did not confront him immediately. He did not escalate prematurely. He waited. This was not indecision. It was preparation. Truman understood something Roosevelt had chosen to avoid. Removing a powerful commander required evidence, not outrage. It required a record so clear that no institutional actor could plausibly deny what had happened. Truman allowed MacArthur to continue just long enough for that record to become unambiguous. Inside the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs were doing the same. George Marshall, now Secretary of Defense, had managed egos his entire career. He had dealt with MacArthur since before the war. He trusted his military ability and distrusted his judgment. Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was more direct. He believed MacArthur was strategically reckless and politically dangerous. Neither man wanted a public confrontation. Both wanted certainty. Korea provided it. From the moment Chinese forces entered the war, MacArthur began preparing the ground for defiance. He did not frame his objections through internal channels. He framed them publicly. He issued communiques that blurred the line between military reporting and policy advocacy. He spoke in absolutes, dismissing limited war as fantasy and containment as surrender. Truman recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it before in the Pacific. MacArthur was not trying to persuade the president. He was trying to constrain him. Behind the scenes, Truman ordered a legal review of MacArthur's authority. The conclusion was straightforward. MacArthur was not an independent actor. He commanded forces on behalf of the president. His authority existed only so long as it aligned with civilian direction. Truman also demanded strategic assessments that excluded MacArthur entirely. Intelligence estimates from the CIA and military planners painted a consistent picture. China could be fought. China could not be subdued quickly. The Soviet response to an expanded war was uncertain but dangerous. Nuclear escalation could not be ruled out. This was not abstract theory. Truman had already made the decision to use atomic weapons once in his presidency. He understood their implications better than any commander advocating their use from afar. MacArthur did not. The president's confidence did not come from personal conviction alone. It came from consensus. Every senior civilian and military advisor Truman trusted agreed on one point. MacArthur could not be allowed to define policy. Not because he was wrong on every tactical detail, but because he rejected the premise that policy constrained him at all. The final stage of preparation was patience. Truman did not act when MacArthur criticized strategy privately. He did not act when MacArthur hinted at escalation. He did not act when MacArthur cultivated allies in Congress. He waited until MacArthur crossed a line that could not be reframed as misunderstanding or passion. When that line was crossed, Truman was ready. The decision was not improvised. It was not reactive. It was the culmination of years of observation and months of deliberate restraint. By the time MacArthur forced the issue, the president already knew the answer. He was not weighing options. He was confirming them. The overrule did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It emerged through pressure, accumulation, and institutional fear, moving slowly until it became impossible to stop. MacArthur was not acting alone. He was acting within a system that had taught him, repeatedly, that defiance carried no penalty if it was politically useful. That lesson had been reinforced for nearly a decade. In Washington, the administration faced constraints that had nothing to do with Korea. Congress was divided. Republicans openly embraced MacArthur as a symbol of lost American resolve. Conservative media portrayed him as the only commander willing to confront communism without hesitation. Any move against him would be framed as weakness, appeasement, or betrayal. Truman understood this environment clearly. He also understood that Roosevelt had survived it by avoiding confrontation. Roosevelt had managed MacArthur by indulging him, redirecting him, and quietly absorbing the damage. That strategy had preserved political stability during a total war. It had also created a commander who believed he could not be stopped. The institutional fear was not irrational. MacArthur's removal threatened congressional investigations, alliance friction, and public outrage. Senior officials worried about morale, not just among civilians, but within the officer corps. If the most decorated general in American history could be dismissed, what did that mean for others? This fear translated into delay. Every time MacArthur pushed, there was pressure to absorb the blow rather than respond. Each incident was treated as manageable in isolation. A statement here, a clarification there, a private message asking him to stay within bounds. But MacArthur was not testing boundaries accidentally. He was applying pressure deliberately. He believed, with reason, that Truman would break first. Every precedent supported that belief. Roosevelt had broken. The Joint Chiefs had accommodated him. Congress admired him. The public trusted him more than any civilian official. MacArthur calculated that Truman would not dare remove him during an act of war. The system reinforced this calculation. Military institutions are designed to resist rupture. They value continuity, hierarchy, and stability. Removing a commander in wartime violates all three. Even those who distrusted MacArthur hesitated to recommend action that might fracture the chain of command. What changed was not MacArthur's behavior. It was the point at which his behavior forced other institutions to choose sides. By openly challenging presidential policy through public correspondence, MacArthur created a situation where neutrality was no longer possible. If the president allowed a field commander to lobby Congress directly on matters of war and peace, then civilian control became theoretical. Authority would flow toward popularity, not legality. That was the moment institutional caution reversed direction. Marshall understood this better than anyone. He had built his career on subordinating personal ambition to civilian authority. He did not admire MacArthur's independence. He tolerated it only as long as it did not threaten the structure itself. When that structure came under threat, Marshall did not hesitate. Bradley was more blunt. He saw MacArthur's actions as insubordination masquerading as strategy. He warned that if MacArthur succeeded, every future commander would feel entitled to do the same. The military would become a political actor, not an instrument of policy. Even those concerned about public reaction reached the same conclusion. The political cost of removing MacArthur was enormous. The cost of not removing him was permanent. Truman did not frame the issue as personal loyalty or military disagreement. He framed it as constitutional necessity. The president could not share authority over war. Either policy controlled the military or the military dictated policy. The overrule took shape quietly. Advisors stopped debating whether MacArthur should be restrained and began debating how he should be removed. The focus shifted from avoidance to execution. Timing mattered. Language mattered. Unity mattered. The Joint Chiefs agreed unanimously, not because they were aligned on strategy, but because they recognized the precedent at stake. Once that consensus existed, hesitation ended. MacArthur had misread the system. He believed its caution meant weakness. He believed political fear would paralyze action indefinitely. He did not recognize that institutions tolerate disruption until their survival is threatened. When that threshold was crossed, restraint disappeared. The overrule was not an emotional rupture. It was a systemic correction, a decision made not to win an argument, but to reassert control over one. From that point forward, the outcome was inevitable. MacArthur had forced the system to choose, and the system chose itself. The consequences unfolded immediately, and they unfolded exactly as expected. Within hours of the announcement, the political shockwave reached every corner of American life. Newspapers broke their printing plates to rewrite headlines. Radio broadcasts interrupted programming. In Tokyo, officers stared at the dismissal cable in disbelief. In Korea, commanders waited for clarification that never came. MacArthur was gone. The battlefield did not collapse. Units did not mutiny. Allied forces did not panic. The war continued, largely unchanged in its military mechanics. That was the first consequence, and it mattered more than any speech or headline. The chain of command held. But politically, the reaction was violent. MacArthur returned to the United States to a reception more suited to a conquering hero than a dismissed officer. Crowds lined the streets. Veterans saluted. Lawmakers rushed to stand beside him. The optics were unmistakable. The general looked vindicated. The president looked isolated. Truman's approval ratings fell to their lowest point of his presidency. Members of Congress openly discussed impeachment. Editorial pages accused him of surrendering Asia. Protest letters flooded the White House by the tens of thousands. The cost Truman had calculated arrived in full. MacArthur did not remain silent. He addressed Congress in a joint session, delivering a speech carefully crafted to avoid explicit defiance while leaving no doubt about his contempt for the policy that had removed him. He framed his dismissal as strategic blindness. He invoked history. He avoided naming Truman directly. The effect was electric. But beneath the spectacle, the machinery of the state continued to function. The new commander in Korea followed orders. Negotiations began months later. The war settled into stalemate, costly and unresolved, but contained. China was not invaded. The Soviet Union did not enter openly. Nuclear weapons remained in use. Those outcomes were not accidental. They were the direct result of the decision made in Washington, not the preferences of the commander removed. Inside the military, the consequences were quieter but more durable. Officers absorbed the lesson without formal instruction. No memo needed to be issued. The precedent was sufficient. A general could be relieved not for losing a battle, but for challenging civilian authority. That understanding reshaped behavior. Public dissent from senior commanders diminished sharply. Strategic disagreements returned to internal channels. The boundary between advice and advocacy hardened. The system adjusted itself. MacArthur, meanwhile, discovered the limits of his support. The initial outrage did not translate into political power. Congressional hearings examined his claims line by line. His proposals for expanding the war were interrogated by men who had access to intelligence he never saw. Gradually, the clarity of his position weakened. What emerged was not a suppressed genius, but a commander whose certainty exceeded his constraints. The hearings did not humiliate him. They did not need to. They exposed the gap between what he wanted and what the country could accept. His warnings of inevitable defeat without escalation failed to materialize. His predictions of collapse did not come true. Time worked against him. For Truman, the consequence was personal. His presidency never recovered politically. He absorbed the damage without reversal. He did not run for another term. He left office deeply unpopular. But the institutional consequence moved in the opposite direction. The principle Truman defended gained strength precisely because it had been enforced at such cost. Civilian control of the military was no longer an abstraction supported by tradition alone. It had been exercised against the most powerful possible test case. That mattered to allies as well. Foreign governments noted the distinction. American commanders did not negotiate policy independently. They did not dictate terms. They executed decisions made elsewhere. In the broader Cold War, this distinction became structural. Limited war, however unsatisfying, became the dominant model. Political objectives constrained military action. Korea established the template, not as victory, but as containment. None of this would have been possible if the decision had gone the other way. Had Truman backed down, the immediate consequence would have been political relief. The deeper consequence would have been irreversible. A precedent would have been set that popularity could override authority, that a commander could veto policy through pressure alone. That did not happen. Instead, the system accepted short-term damage to preserve long-term control. MacArthur lived out his remaining years respected, admired, and ultimately sidelined. He never held command again. His influence faded without formal suppression. He became a symbol rather than a force. The war he wanted never occurred. The war Truman feared did not begin. The cost of the decision was real. So was its effect. The battlefield consequences were measured in casualties and stalemate. The institutional consequence was measured in continuity. One outcome ended careers. The other preserved control. Both traced directly back to the same decision, made in the early hours of April 11, 1951, when a president accepted political ruin to prevent something worse. The consequences were not heroic. They were structural, and they endured. The post-war record closed the case slowly, without drama, and without mercy. In the months following MacArthur's dismissal, the Senate hearings became the central arena where history began to assert itself. What had been framed as a clash between a heroic general and an obstinate president was reduced, piece by piece, to documents, timelines, and sworn testimony. MacArthur spoke first. He was confident, composed, and absolute. He repeated the same core argument he had made in private and in public. Limited war was incoherent, containment was defeat by delay, and failure to strike China guaranteed eventual catastrophe. He did not retreat from his position. He doubled down on it. Then others spoke. The Joint Chiefs testified in sequence. Not as politicians, as administrators of risk. They explained the intelligence picture MacArthur had not controlled. Soviet capabilities. Allied vulnerabilities. The absence of public support for a wider war. The fragility of Europe. They did not accuse MacArthur of treason or incompetence. They described his proposals as operationally dangerous and strategically unsustainable. George Marshall's testimony was decisive. He did not criticize MacArthur's courage or service. He did not challenge his reputation. He explained the structure of command. He stated plainly that no military commander, regardless of stature, had the authority to set national policy. The issue was not whether MacArthur's plan might work. The issue was that he attempted to impose it. Omar Bradley was less diplomatic. He described MacArthur's approach as reckless and his understanding of modern war as incomplete. Bradley's most quoted line came without emphasis. A war with China would be the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. It was not rhetoric. It was assessment. The hearings did not produce a reversal. They produced clarity. As transcripts circulated, public opinion began to shift. Slowly, incompletely. The anger did not vanish, but it lost coherence. The fear MacArthur had predicted did not materialize. South Korea did not fall. The Soviet Union did not intervene openly. The war did not expand. Time did what argument could not. MacArthur's predictions failed one by one. His certainty, once persuasive, began to look inflexible. The authority he had claimed no longer aligned with events. The system he had challenged continued to function without him. Truman never benefited politically from this outcome. His reputation recovered only after he left office. Historians revisited the decision with access to intelligence MacArthur never had and constraints he never accepted. The judgment became consistent across decades. The dismissal was necessary. Not admirable. Necessary. The post-war civil-military framework absorbed the lesson fully. Future commanders were cautious where MacArthur had been bold. Disputes were contained. Public defiance became rare. When it did occur, it was short-lived. The precedent stood. Roosevelt's tolerance was reinterpreted as expedience, not wisdom. Truman's action was understood as corrective, not impulsive. The difference between the two presidencies became structural rather than personal. One had managed power by accommodation. The other had enforced its limits. MacArthur's legacy stabilized into contradiction. He remained a brilliant organizer, a gifted administrator, and a commander of immense presence. He also became the example cited when civilian authority was challenged. His name entered doctrine not as a warning against failure, but against autonomy. The record did not condemn him. It contextualized him. By the time Cold War strategy matured, the logic Truman defended had become foundational. Wars could be limited. Generals could be restrained. Political objectives could override operational desire. None of this guaranteed success. It guaranteed control. That distinction defined the post-war order. The case did not end with vindication or disgrace. It ended with alignment. The system survived the stress test. The decision remained. The case closes without ambiguity. Douglas MacArthur was not dismissed because he lost Korea. He was dismissed because he rejected the idea that a general serves policy rather than defines it. His removal was not a judgment on his courage, intelligence, or past victories. It was a judgment on authority. Franklin Roosevelt had tolerated MacArthur because the system could absorb the damage during a total war. The stakes were absolute. Unity mattered more than discipline. Roosevelt chose political containment over institutional confrontation, and he accepted the long-term risk. Harry Truman faced a different war and a different danger. Korea was limited by design. Escalation was optional. That made control, not victory, the decisive variable. Truman understood that once a commander could force policy through public pressure, civilian authority ceased to exist in practice. MacArthur believed popularity was protection. For years, he was correct. That belief shaped his behavior. It encouraged defiance, public advocacy, and unilateral judgment. It worked until it threatened the system itself. At that point, tolerance became failure. Truman did not act as a strategist trying to win Korea. He acted as a custodian of command. He accepted political damage to prevent institutional erosion. The cost was immediate and personal. The benefit was abstract and enduring. The war continued. The Republic held. MacArthur left the stage convinced he was right. History did not argue with him directly. It simply moved forward without him. His predictions did not materialize. His authority did not return. His example became cautionary rather than inspirational. Roosevelt managed power by accommodation. Truman managed it by enforcement. One approach preserved harmony. The other preserved hierarchy. Only one could survive the Cold War intact. This was not a heroic decision. It was not popular. It did not produce victory. It produced control. And control, once lost, cannot be reclaimed without force. The verdict stands. The system chose survival over spectacle. It chose precedent over personality. It chose the presidency over the general. The file is closed. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped wars long before the shooting stopped, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you believe power should be tolerated or constrained when victory is not at stake.